This is the Inclusion Think Tank podcast brought to you by New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education, NJCIE, where we talk about inclusive education, why it works, and how to make it happen. On today's episode, I welcome my guest, Dr. Jessica McQueston. Dr. McQueston is an assistant professor at Sam Houston State University. On this episode, which is part one of our conversation, Jessica and I discuss the important role that higher education professionals have in educating future educators about inclusive education and why it is important to use appropriate language when discussing disabilities. I would like to welcome everyone back to another episode of the Inclusion Think Tank podcast brought to you by New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education. I am your host, Arthur Aston, and I am happy to have my guest on today with me, Dr. Jessica McQueston. So, Jessica, thank you for joining me today. It is a pleasure to have you on and to see you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be on here.
Yes. Uh, you and I, we had a chance to talk a few weeks ago about this conversation, and I'm really excited for for the information that we will be sharing and discussing today on the podcast. So to get started, can you share with us a little bit about yourself and tell us who is Jessica, and also can you share with us how you became interested in the world of inclusive education?
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Jessica McQueston, but I go by Jessica. I even tell my students, I'm like, just it's fine. Like, I'm not concerned about a title. um, and so I'm currently an assistant professor at Sam Houston State University, which is about an hour north of Houston, Texas. And so I just joined the faculty here this year, and so I was at a previous institution for 2 years. So, um, you know, definitely fun to start during COVID as a faculty member. Um, Prior to this, I was a K-6 special educator, general educator, even a literacy interventionist for a bit. I just feel like, it depended on the week. I feel like it was what my job title was. And as special educators, I feel like that's kind of the name of the game is we are flexible, we do what needs to happen for our students. Um, I also am someone with a disability, and so I know we'll talk about language a little bit later. But I experienced disability about 10 years ago. And so, one thing that I think is important is, I was always seen as like, I embrace this mentality of like, oh, I'm helping others. I don't need accommodations. I don't need support. And, again, about 10 years ago, life happened, this diagnosis, that diagnosis, whatever. And so I've had to kind of adjust and like view my change or like kind of process this change of like accepting help and needing help and like navigating that. Um, and so I will say in the last like 3 to 4 years, I've really started to embrace my identity as someone with a disability. And, I would, around that time too, I started to kind of really take ownership and say like, no, I'm disabled. And again, I know we'll talk about the power of language in a little bit, but you know, I view it as a positive and it's part of my identity. And I share that with my students, with anyone I work with. I'm pretty open about it because I think there's nothing to hide about it. Like I'm not ashamed of my disability at all. Um, so what really drove me to inclusive education? Well, um, it really stems honestly from my childhood. So I went to school in Texas, in the Houston area, like my K through 12 schooling. And we didn't really have students with disabilities around. And so I know, some of this is shifting but students, especially with the most extensive or complex support needs, they were in a totally different wing. Like they were not allowed, like quote unquote allowed to come out and be with anyone else without a disability. I think there was this fear like they may get us sick or, like they can't handle it. And I know we still see some of that today
Hmm.
with segregation, but um, really just seeing students excluded in schools. Um, and then I think what really hit home of why we need inclusive education for me was in middle school. My mom was a special education paraprofessional and started volunteering with Special Olympics because several of her students were participating in Special Olympics. And so all of a sudden, I realized that there were students that I had gone to school with since I was like in kindergarten and first grade that I had never knew. And they literally lived in my neighborhood, right? And I had no idea they were the same grade as me. And so that was really kind of eye opening to me of like, wow, this is problematic. Even as a 12, 13-year old, I recognized that like this should not be happening. And so um, when I started to look for colleges, I wanted to look at both special education and general education, and specifically elementary education, because of those experiences, because of realizing that this is still happening, students are still segregated, and so I ended up going to the University of New Mexico for their dual license program. So I was able to graduate with a general education and special education license to teach. And so I really enjoyed that because it focused in on inclusive education. And I felt like I could kind of bridge that gap between these like often like siloed communities in schools. And so um, I thought that I could help bridge that gap. Um, and then, of course, then I got into schools as a new teacher and realized, wow, this is still happening. It's not just
Hmm.
from when I was a kid in the 90s, like the early 90s, late 80s, all that. Is this still happening? And 2009 is when I started teaching. So, um, yeah, I see the value in it. I've, you know, advocated for that with my students with disabilities as a teacher. And so I just really, I am very passionate about inclusive education. Sorry, that was a very long answer to that.
No, it was great though, and it showed that you I always say it's so interesting how children understand things a lot better sometimes than adults do. and
I know.
and as a
It's
child you realize like, hey, wait, this is a whole group of people that live in my neighborhood that are the same age as me that I
yeah,
don't know, that I've never seen before. And like,
right.
what is that about? Like, you had
Mhm.
questions about that, and that was that when you said that, I was like, wow, like that's really like that's really wild to think about. And but the fact that you noticed it as a child yourself, to say like,
Mhm.
wait, something's not right here. What
Yeah.
is and how can we fix it, and how can you be a part of making that change, is
Mhm.
really impressive to to have those thoughts as a child, and to really recognize that again, that something's just not right about this. There's something that needs to be done.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad that you did give that answer, and shared so much of your own story, because I think um, in sharing these stories, I say all the time with the guests that we have, your passion and your dedication to making the world more inclusive in education, um, it really shows. And then, when you tell your story, it's like, oh, okay, because you've been thinking about this for a very long time.
Yeah. Like,
So like, it
you
makes
know,
sense.
yeah, absolutely.
It's
I
not
mean,
just something that just popped into your head like, oh, I want to do this. And it's like, no,
right.
you really noticed the need for the change. And then
Yes.
you made it your career path, and you're
Yeah.
doing great things.
I mean, I try.
Yes, 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 as we all do, right?
Yes, we all do. We're all giving our best, I feel like, every
Yes,
day.
absolutely, for sure. So this season on the podcast, we're focusing on those in school leadership positions and how they can impact and influence the inclusive school environment. So, as a professor who is educating the next generation of educators, what role and influence do you feel higher education professionals have on the future of inclusive education?
Oh, I feel like that's a huge question. And um, I really view it as like, okay, let me back up. Like in society, we obviously know that we want, so many of us are fighting for inclusive education, inclusive housing, inclusive, environments and communities. And yet we still are like having this fight, right? And so one of the things that I think about as a professor is that we have that impact on future educators that are going out in the field and can ultimately be the people that advocate for inclusive education for students with disabilities. And so I really view it as like we're setting the tone in higher ed. So what we allow students to, and when I say students, I mean university students, but what we allow university students to, submit for their classes and how they talk about students with disabilities and how we perpetuate or address language on how we talk about students with disabilities, it really sets the tone for their career. So if we as, higher ed professionals, if we don't kind of set that tone, set that expectation, and kind of address that they're going to hear some negative remarks in schools, they're going to hear some outdated language, they're going to hear, and see these things, but here's how they can advocate for it and here's how they can change. I really feel like what we do is so important because not only do we have the ability to change the future for you know a group of student like K through 12 students each year, but really when I'm preparing pre-service educators, if I'm like, for example, I'm working with between my two undergrad classes, I have I think like 45 to 50 students. And so I'm ultimately impacting, 50 times 25 students that they'll have each year. And so what we do here in higher ed, I think is so important. Like we're the starting point, and we have to kind of open their eyes to the value of inclusive education and really being advocates for students with disabilities. I also think, and many you know programs for pre-service teachers might only have one class on special education, and so especially if they're general educators, they might have that one class. And so when we think about, wow, we have this one opportunity, we have this 15 weeks, this one semester to make this change, in how they think, because again, I can't control what other professors are teaching, um not only at my institution, but all institutions across the US. Like, I don't have that ability. I would love to have a magic wand and just say, like, teach inclusive education, teach, the power of language, teach this, but I don't, right? And so um, I really think that, we are the starting point where we set the tone for how they talk about students, because we're not kind of fixing issues, we're like teaching them from the ground up. And so that's one thing that keeps me in higher education, because yes, I do miss being in the classroom. um, Even with all the chaos the last few years, there's times I'm like, oh, I wish I could just go back in the classroom. I really miss it. I miss working with the kids and I love it. And then I think about like, okay, but not only am I impacting one class over this year, like I'm impacting hundreds, if not thousands of students every year because I'm teaching their future teachers.
Wow. Yeah, that is, wow, that's so true. Like you said, for however many students they're teaching each year, you have an impact because they're taking the knowledge that you gave them in their courses, and they're taking it with them into their professions. And um, again, like you said, that's really it's very interesting that you said they may only have one special education course,
Mhm.
and they're expected to learn so much in just a 15-week semester when, there's so much information there. And you can hope that, that students will continue to learn on their own and educate themselves about certain topics and look deeper into certain things that are covered in the class. But just the fact that they only are required to take the one course in special education, that is, that's a lot to take in, and like you said, in just one short semester, 15 weeks goes by very quickly.
Well, and there's also programs that don't even have a whole class.
Hmm.
Like, my previous institution, it was just a few weeks of one class. And so you imagine like we as professors, like we have to make such a big impact when we only have one class or only one part of a class. Like it's so important. And so I really feel like, if we want to make this change, like, we talk about how many students are excluded. I know we had talked about this on our like before meeting of like how many students are still excluded and segregated from their peers, without disabilities. And so if we want to change that, we have to kind of get this new generation that are going out into the field and really make this impact and really be strong advocates.
Yes, for sure. And it's again, that whole the like I just kind of like visualized what you were saying of, you're teaching this group of current university students, but then they'll go on to teach for years. I know teachers that have been teaching for 30 and 40 years.
Right.
So just to
Yeah.
think of that greater impact that you have on students, and it really it made me think of myself, honestly, because I also have a disability, and the children that I interact
Mhm.
with my friends who have kids, and my niece and my nephew, and just people that I encounter out in the world, and um, the experience that I can give them of learning about my disability and what it means and why I have to use a wheelchair or why I have to use crutches. It can make them a more kind person to someone they meet in school who has a disability, and not think that it's strange that they have to use crutches, and they can think of me and say, it's not a problem, it's not a big deal that Johnny in my
Right.
class has to has to use a wheelchair. So it's
Exactly.
it's all in the interactions that we have with people that can really have an impact on the broader community around us, and beyond what we can even reach ourselves as just one person.
Yeah. I also think about you know, obviously, like I went to school, this wasn't that long ago, right? Like,
Hmm.
well, maybe I am a little bit old, but like, the early 90s, like I was in schools. And so, like, I think about like that's really not that long ago,
That
and
wasn't.
that's still happening, right? And
Hmm.
so we still know it's happening by data. But think about people who went to school 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. They had no experience with people with disabilities. And
Hmm.
so, um, and if despite their age, like if they are just happen to be in a segregated kind of school community or state that has a lot of segregation of students with disabilities, then like they really don't have this exposure, this knowledge, this firsthand experience about people with disabilities, or they don't know they have experience, right?
Hmm.
Because disabilities aren't all visible. Like,
Right.
I present as someone without a disability, which I understand and recognize that like privilege of having invisible disabilities.
Hmm.
Um, you know, but that's not the case for everyone. And so I think we have to also recognize and kind of have that conversation with people of, disability doesn't have a look, right? Disability is
True.
looks like any person.
True. That is so true, and so important to bring up. Um, and something else that you brought up, which leads into my next question, is language. And
Mhm.
I know I've been a part of many conversations, especially in the last few years. A lot of conversations have taken place online, and I was a part of there's an app called Clubhouse, which is just a big, it's a voice chat. So you go into the chat rooms, but everybody kind of talks. They talk, they don't type anything. So it's actually, you're hearing people's voices. And it really picked up over the last few years with the pandemic. So there have been a lot of conversations on that app and other places and in the news as it relates to language that is used, as the language relates to those who have disabilities. Um, a few of the conversations that I can think of, that have been fairly popular is not saying the R word and not using euphemisms like differently abled or handy capable. And a big one is the person first versus identity first language. Um, those are all conversations that I've seen and have had with certain people. So, can you talk about the importance of using appropriate language and the effect it can have when we're talking about people with disabilities?
Yeah, I think this is so important. And I think first we have to really recognize that diversity is a natural form of human diversity. And I think when we recognize that, we have to then kind of normalize the conversation around disability. So I think for so long we thought of this as like disability as like, oh, they're unique, they're special, they're this, they're that, right? Because they're not human like. And so we might think of them as like as babies, like perpetual babies, like we have to protect them and this and that. And so um I think we've kind of come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. Because again, when we recognize it's a normal part of, or normal form of human diversity, we kind of recognize that people with disabilities are human, right? They're not like this other. And so, you know, I also think that disability is not a bad word. And I think so many people often think, oh, I can't say disability. I'm gonna say like, oh, they're handy capable instead. And
Mhm.
it kind of I think a lot of people, including myself, we've really pushed back against that because it's like disability is not a bad word. You can say it, it's
Right.
not something to be ashamed of. I know some, different cultures have different views on it, but I think, it's important, like I said, like it's part of human diversity. It's people with disabilities have existed since the beginning of time. And guess what? They're going to keep existing,
Right.
like they're not going to disappear tomorrow.
Right. Yeah, we're not going
So,
anywhere. We're here to
yeah,
stay.
like we're here to stay. And, let's also think about like throughout someone's lifetime, they have a statistically a good chance of experiencing disability, at some point in their life. Um, and so I I also think like one other thing that I think about is, we have to kind of push back on these euphemisms and um also like sped. Like I think that's a big one. Oh, they're a sped student. They're in sped. There's this and a lot of people in the community really push back on that and even go as far as to say it's a slur. And personally, I agree. Um, but I think kind of one of the big debates that I'm sure you've seen, on Clubhouse and other apps is like this idea of identity first versus person first. And so, for a long time we had identity first, but it was seen as like this othering thing, like, oh, it's the disabled, right? Like this other group of people, they're not included, they're not us. And then this like person first language came around of like, oh, I'm a person with a disability, it's a person with Down syndrome. Um, and that's great, right? It respects the human first as it's just the disability is just part of them.
Mhm.
And then I think in the last few years there's really been a push with some people, again, not all, like the
Right.
disability community is not a monolith. Um, And so there's really been this like push of like, no, it's part of my identity. It's who I am. And so like personally, I've come to embrace it about myself, that I'm disabled. And again, I know not everyone uses that.
Mhm.
And so I think it goes back into like choice, so there's not this like fast and like hard and fast rule that's like, oh, you have to do this or you have to do that. Because again, we're not a monolith. And so um we have to respect what each person wants.
Mhm.
But I do think it's important to note that like we have some people that don't yet, you know, they're not able to yet communicate their needs. They might not even know that they have a disability. If you have a first grader, they might not understand or yet be told that they have a disability. And so they haven't had that chance to kind of identify and and look at their own identity and see, what do I want to be called? How do I want to think about this? And recognize this within myself. And so um I think it's just something to ask.
Mm.
I know a lot of my university students, they're like, oh, I would just want a hard and fast rule. And so I always tell them, start with person first. If the person doesn't want that, they'll tell you, or you can ask.
Mm-hmm.
um but especially when you're working with young kids, like, you should start with person first. um but again, just ask. Like, I think of it as, it should just be a question like pronouns, like, what are your pronouns?
Mm-hmm.
um if someone says they have a disability, then just ask them, like, how do you like to refer to yourself, person first or identity first? um but yeah, I really, this is such a huge topic in the field, and I think, yes, it's very important, but one thing I will say is that I think how we talk about people with disabilities or disabled people is more important. So are we using deficit-based language? Are we using um or are we using strengths-based language? So in a, I think about like the school setting, like a K through 12, it's like, I'm sure many of us have looked at IEPs and we've said, like, wow, I just read this entire document and there's not a single thing that they can do in according to this IEP. It's all what they can't do, that they can't do this, they can't do that, they can't do this. And so, yes, language not only relates to this, like, identity first and person first, but also how we talk about people.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really have to be, respectful. And again, it's part of human diversity. So people with disabilities are people,
Yes.
so right? Like, it seems like a simple concept, and yet we still see that, right? We still see people saying, like, oh, they're just differently abled. And it's like, no, it's
Right.
not. Stop with the euphemisms. Like,
Well,
stop it.
hey, and like you said, it's part of diversity. And as the saying goes, I'm sure I've used it on this podcast, and I know I've heard it many times before. If you met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability. So
Yes.
where you prefer identity first language, I might prefer person first language, and that's okay.
Yeah.
And I love how you said, the conversations and how we're talking about those who have disabilities, and is it a strength or a deficit based approach, and that really truly makes a big difference.
Yeah. Well, and I think that can also frame, like, so for me, like, I just started kind of using identity first language. If you would have asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I didn't.
Hmm.
And so of course that can evolve over time too. Um, but there are people that, like, I've worked with or talked with or whatever over the years, and they used really harmful language about people with disabilities. And so, like, with them, I might not use identity first with them, because I'm like, you really don't understand it. You are really thinking that, like, disability is bad and it's only who I am, and that it makes me be seen as different. And so that's something else to consider too, is like, where's the respect? Like, do they understand that disability is just, you know, a natural form of diversity, just like anything else.
Hmm.
Um, and that can impact how we talk about our own identity and how we think about students too, or how they think about students.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Inclusion Think Tank podcast, brought to you by New Jersey Coalition for Inclusive Education. This concludes part 1 of my conversation with Dr. Jessica McQueston. Join us again next time when we continue our conversation to discuss how inclusive curriculum can be beneficial to all students. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast or Spotify, and to follow us on all social media platforms at NJCIE. Until next time.